cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war. As chaos reigns over the systems of Stanton and Pyro, locked in a spiral which will only end in bloodshed and tears. Come, join me as we investigate the Slicer incident and the beginnings of the First Stanton-Pyro War. My name is Paul Shelley, and welcome to The AstroHistorian. This is a channel dedicated to exploring and explaining the lore of sci-fi and space universes and discussing their impact. Today, we're talking about the lore behind one of the first, and at this time latest, story events in the Star Citizen universe, Save Stanton, and the fight for Pyro. To start, let me add a caveat. This isn't intended to be a full review of the game or its current status as a game. Purely an explanation for those who didn't do Save Stanton event since the beginning and introduce the first three major factions for the game whom you can gain affinity or ire: the Citizens for Prosperity, Frontier Fighters, and Headhunters. I will talk a little bit about how this narrative event has gone, but this isn't a discussion on bugs or any other issues which plague the game as it stands right now. Now, let's begin where this story really starts, with the tragic death of an innocent hauler. A solitary trader, Kuya Endicott, was making a routine run. The run was a haul he had done hundreds of times, flying processed food from Stanton to settlements in Pyro, and returning with iron and hephaestonite. Kuya was born and raised in Pyro, and knew the system intimately. He also knew how vital his hauls were to those eking out an honest living in the lawless system. Without his routine run for supplies, many of the honest people of Pyro, who were just trying to make a living in the harsh system, wouldn't make it. Unfortunately, Kuya's run on this fateful day in April of 2947 would be different. His ship exited Quantum near the Pyro-Stanton jump and arrived in the middle of a firefight between rival gangs. Amidst the chaos and confusion, Kuya's ship came under fire, and he was killed. His best friend, Madge Hartford, a Stanton resident, was devastated by Kuya's death. While it's never been confirmed, it is likely, given how deeply his death affected Dash, that they were in some kind of relationship, which they kept under wraps due to her position in Hurston Dynamics as an accountant. Dash would eventually seek solace at a grief and bereavement support group. There, she'd befriended others who had lost loved ones to outlaws in Pyro. During one meeting, Hartford admitted she might only ever find comfort by extracting revenge upon those who killed Kuya. Much to her surprise, several people approached her after the meeting to say they felt the same. This group began to associate outside of meetings and discuss how they could change Pyro for the better. What started off as a way for victims of Pyro violence to blow off steam quickly evolved into this ad hoc militia, upgrading their gear and organizing military-style training exercises. Eventually, their de facto leader, Hartford, quit her job at Hurston Dynamics and began organizing raids into Pyro full-time. While it's not confirmed, this is likely the origin of the Frontier Fighters, a militia vigilante group hell-bent on genociding the whole Pyro system. These incursions led to violent skirmishes with some outlaws, with the group managing to clear many outlaw encampments in Pyro, but the loss of a few of their own members. To make matters worse, they'd take losses clearing a settlement only to return days later to see that a new group had moved in, effectively making the loss of their valued members pointless. Exasperated, Hartford knew the only way they could ever stop this cycle was by living at the cleared settlement themselves. This idea stuck with Hartford, and in 2949, she stopped organizing and leading raids into Pyro. Instead, Hartford filled her ship with processed food and began doing Kuya's old run. This soured her relationship with her former militia group, who did not believe that her more peaceful attempts to pacify the system would work. At best, they thought that she was naive, and at worst, a traitor to the cause which she helped create in the first place. Still, she persisted in her new approach. Hartford's hauls were about more than just the supplies. Along the way, she took the time to talk with those making an honest living and ask how else she could help. Hartford initially found the people in Pyro to be untrusting of her. Many were loners, paranoid that she was collecting intel for one of Pyro's many gangs, or content with the devil they knew. Yet, she continued to do the hauls and built a rapport with the folks in several outposts. They taught Hartford how to navigate the constant coronal mass ejections, where to avoid unless you wanted trouble, and most importantly, what supplies were always in constant demand. As Hartford learned about the challenge and intricacies of the system, she came to believe that the path to peace in Pyro would be through profitability. She believed that the only things that can make real systemic changes in Pyro, like companies or the government, would only come if it was beneficial to their bottom line. To that end, she formed Citizens for Pyro and spoke to anyone and everyone about her vision and how her new group would lay the groundwork for others to live within and profit off the system. Branded as Build a Beachhead, Hartford's plan consisted of clearing, holding, and populating sites around Pyro to foster the growth of legitimate business and trade. She envisioned a series of strongly fortified and strategically located settlements where a legitimate hauler, miner, or salvager could safely work, live, and travel between. Once the CFP established a substantial foothold, Hartford believed bigger businesses and organizations would be drawn into Pyro and be willing to help establish real law and order. Hartford painted an enticing picture, but pulled no punches about how difficult it would be initially to establish and protect these sites. She believed it would be foolish to deny that there would be resistance from local gangs. Yet, instead of dwelling on it, Hartford focused on how people could make their fortune in Pyro, specifically highlighting how advances in mining would help access resources previously undiscovered or deemed not worth the effort, that the system contained special harvestables, and that centuries of human habitation meant that scrap was abundant. Hartford courted both residents of Stanton and Pyro to join Citizens for Pyro. While some became enamored with her vision, others only saw folly. Initially, she hoped to partner with her former raiding party to coordinate attacks on encampments that the CFP could then occupy. Most refused to join, believing that she was turning her back on the real fight. It is likely that at this time, this group would go on to form the core of what we know today as the Frontier Fighters. Meanwhile, settlements in Pyro rejected the help and upgraded security measures offered by the CFP, fearful that it would only draw gang attention and anger. Materials and credits donated during Hartford's initial media blitz announcing the creation of the CFP quickly dried up. Zealous volunteers grew to understand the true obstacles ahead and lost faith in the mission. The group seemed to be destined to fade into obscurity. Then, in early 2951, XenoThreat attacked Stanton, and everything changed for the Citizens for Pyro. On February 4th, 2951, a message was transmitted announcing XenoThreat's revolutionary campaign beginning in the Stanton system, ostensibly to send a message to the UEE that XenoThreat was the real power and voice of humanity. Navy intelligence reported an intermediate force on an intercept course for the Stanton system, due to arrive in less than 48 hours. Advocacy Special Agent in Charge Rowena Dooley activated the Civilian Defense Force to provide support for naval forces against this imminent incursion. The next day, the UES Warhammer, an Aegis-class Javelin destroyer and the flagship of the Navy in Stanton, was being restocked at INS Jericho when their supply convoys came under attack from XenoThreat. SAIC Dooley tasked the CDF with retrieving the lost supplies and providing security for the effort. This came with the complication that all of the supplies were in some way volatile. While this operation was underway, XenoThreat forces made use of an Idris railgun to take cheap shots at the immobilized Javelin still in dock, though was ultimately unsuccessful. A week later, on February 11th, XenoThreat deployed multiple Capital-class vessels to Stanton, along with a complement of fighter escorts, in an effort to destabilize the system. The CDF urged anyone with a combat vessel and appropriate training to take up the fight. The battle raged on and off for 3 days, but by the 14th, the UEE Navy and CDF successfully pushed XenoThreat out of Stanton. The group made their retreat back to their home system of Pyro following a decisive defeat. XenoThreat's incursion sent shockwaves throughout Stanton. The inability of the corporate-led governments to coordinate an effective response and repel the attack forced the advocacy to mobilize the civilian defense force to save the system. Suddenly, Pyro's gang problem had become Stanton's problem. Hartford, seeing an opportunity, went on another whirlwind media tour, doing countless interviews with news outlets and spectrum shows about the CFP's mission, and preaching that the only way to resolve Stanton's problems would be to address the root of the issue in Pyro. Volunteers and donations began flowing into the CFP in record numbers. Even some of Hartford's old raiding party put their differences aside, leaving the frontier fighters, and joined. These combat veterans then handpicked and trained recruits, and by mid-2951 began raiding and then holding gang encampments in Pyro. Hartford was eager to prove that the CFP could stake their claim in Pyro, though she would later admit that the plan was never to hold these specific encampments long-term. Instead, the CFP's initial strategy was to draw gang attention to these locations and force outlaws to defend Pyro instead of raid Stanton. Meanwhile, covert plans were underway to occupy and hold several strategically important outposts across the system. As of today, the CFP have already taken and established several of these bases, including Jackson's Swamp on Monox and Canard View on Terminus, and have plans to establish more. Although Hartford has remained cautiously optimistic about the CFP's progress in Pyro, others around the Empire have looked to it as the model for how to address an issue plaguing many systems. Politicians, militia leaders, civilian security services, and more have all reached out to the group for advice. This inspired Hartford to organize a conference with representatives from other systems connected to Pyro to explain their plan and gauge interest in starting CFP chapters of their own. Soon, CFP members were escorting representatives from these systems and others, including Davian, Nexus, and Virgil, around their bases in Pyro and sharing operational information. The immense interest in CFP operations drove Hartford to think bigger, and in March of 2954, she officially rebranded Citizens for Pyro into Citizens for Prosperity. Later that year, another incident in the Stanton system would throw the spotlight on Pyro, when a completely unknown gang would enact a campaign of chaos even worse than the XenoThreat incursions had years before. On November 12, 2954, the first reports of an unknown pirate group hitting haulers all over the Stanton system was reported on SSN/CATV. The attacks were well coordinated and were for an unknown purpose. With the system already suffering from not only the XenoThreat incursions, but a rise in crime in both the Jumptown Wars and the emergence of both the brutal Nine Tails gang and a new branch of the Ottoni Syndicate, the corporations that ran Stanton were struggling to maintain the peace as it was. Within a few days, it became clear that this was an orchestrated attack on the system by a brand new criminal organization from Pyro calling themselves the Slicers. This revelation caused the local advocacy presence to once again activate the CDF to strike back at the Slicers, whom they discovered had managed to hide amongst local outlaw groups like the Dusters, where they had been gathering information for this invasion. After a week of rooting out the embedded forces on the group and either killing their leaders or destroying their supplies, a report began to surface of sightings of a new threat prowling Stanton: captured Idris M frigates controlled by the Slicers. The CDF would manage to destroy or capture these frigates and destroy their escorts, pushing back the Slicers and removing them from Stanton for good. The aftermath of this invasion was devastating. Unlike the mostly focused attacks of XenoThreat on the UEE government assets and ships, the Slicers were indiscriminate in their actions, often targeting civilians or using other groups as literal bullet shields and scapegoats for their own actions. It was clear in the aftermath that first and foremost, the Slicers' goal was to cause as much damage as possible to the people of Stanton. This is where the two major players from earlier in the story would return: the Frontier Fighters and the Citizens for Prosperity. Each group sent out calls for supplies to respond to the aggression of the Slicers by striking back into Pyro and pacifying it, each in their own unique way. The CFP focused on their mission to make Pyro a safe place for corporate and government expansion, and the FF doing what they did best: kill every last person in the Pyro system, believing the system was beyond hope. Once both groups gathered enough resources, they began their counterattack, with the CFP bolstering their own presence with increased aid and frontier fighters striking out against outlaw outposts. It was then that both forces caught the attention of one of the oldest and most powerful groups in the Pyro system, the Headhunters. Started out of Virgil in 2610, the Headhunters began as a smuggling ring who specialized in fast shipping from Virgil to Terra through Nyx and Pyro that proved to be difficult for authorities to detect. By the 2620s, they fully relocated their headquarters to Ruin Station, where they could more easily avoid encounters with the Advocacy. It was during this era that they adopted the human skull into their symbolism, and began including motifs of it in their tattoos, personal decor, and graffiti. A location marked with a headhunter skull warned other criminals that the area was under their control. Gradually, over the 27th century, the Headhunters gained more and more influence on the region, as it was torn apart by a series of violent gang wars for the control of Ruin Station itself. These wars, which I have dubbed the Wars of the Prophet, weakened small and large gangs alike, as they all claimed a religious prophecy to become the ruler of Ruin Station, the effective capital of the system. If you want to learn more about these wars, you should check out a video I recently did on the entire history of the Pyro system in the description and in the top right. Headhunters slowly continued to influence and control the system, and by the end of the 27th century had all but conquered Pyro. However, by the 28th century, things began to change. The Drop Kings challenged the Headhunters' authority in the 2740s in an effort to expand their smuggling network, resulting in a series of conflicts that caused control of Ruin Station to pass back and forth between the gangs for several decades. Eventually, this conflict would end in 2912, as the Drop Kings clashed with a third criminal syndicate, forcing them to withdraw from Pyro altogether. However, since the 2930s, the Headhunters have been slowly losing ground, first to smaller, more hungry gangs in Pyro, and then to the splinter group formed by one of their own leaders, Rook, now called Rough and Ready, and finally with the arrival of XenoThreat in 2944, who would take Ruin Station. While still a major force in the system, the Headhunters had been losing their grip little by little until the arrival of the CFP, and now Frontier Fighters, galvanized the group to fight back and regain control of lost territory. This three-way war has been spilling out all over the system in the early months of 2955, with the Frontier Fighters becoming an unlikely antagonist. While the Headhunters have mostly been focused on the Frontier Fighters, it seemed the Frontier Fighters have been more interested in attacking and killing the Citizens for Prosperity. It soon became apparent in mid-February that the CFP had discovered information on the Frontier Fighters, information that the violent militia didn't want to reach UEE space, as the two sides battled it out over info-running Star Runners dispatched by the CFP, while other FF forces attempted to destroy databanks controlled by the CFP. It was soon revealed in a dispatch by the CDF what the CFP had uncovered. Between data from Pyro and investigations by advocacy and local Stanton law enforcement, it became clear that the Frontier Fighters were in fact the Slicers. According to the reports, they had disguised themselves as an unknown Pyro outlaw group to rain chaos and destruction on Stanton, and galvanize the local population to support a violent incursion into Pyro, what is commonly known as a false flag operation, where a faction intentionally does harm to its own people in the guise of an outside force to rally support against that outside force. In response, the advocacy labeled them as a criminal gang, and the CDF labeled them as an enemy of the Empire, canceling all contracts with known members and sympathizers of the Frontier Fighters, and effectively banning them from running operations out of the Stanton system. In response, the CFP and Headhunters seem to have set aside their differences and focused their efforts on eliminating the Frontier Fighters for their actions as the Slicers, and as of this moment, are eliminating the last of the faction as a viable force. That is where the first narrative arc inside Star Citizen has ended for now, but the threads of this story have been teased to continue on in the future throughout the year. I have my own thoughts of which I will share further towards the end of the video. For now, I'd like to talk about some of the central unanswered questions that still linger, namely the true motives behind XenoThreat, Citizens for Prosperity, and the Frontier Fighters. To start, it's important to ask an age-old legal and criminal investigation question. Cui bono? Or simply, who benefits? Who benefits from XenoThreat's takeover of Ruin Station and the evasion of the Stanton system? Who benefits from the CFP's mission to pacify and gentrify Pyro? And who benefits from the Frontier Fighters' efforts to genocide an entire population? If we can answer these questions, we might be able to start to unwrap what the narrative designers and writers have in mind for each of these factions. Yes, even the Frontier Fighters, who I doubt we have seen the last of. To start off, let's talk about XenoThreat. While the main focus of the story thus far has not been on them, their in-fiction role as rulers of Ruin Station, despite Ruin currently having rough and ready theming, has been steadfast throughout most of the story, and they remain on the sidelines, likely to be a focus soon. They are the top dogs of Pyro and have been since their arrival in 2944. Their forces present during the invasion of Stanton in February of 2951 prove that they might have some kind of major backing, with access to not only many light, medium, and heavy fighters, but also multiple military-issue Idris-class frigates. For an overtly political gang who is obsessed with a conspiracy theory about the alien takeover of the UEE government, they seem to have a lot of sophisticated technology at their disposal, and effective tactics to help cripple the small UEE Navy presence in Stanton. Additionally, we know that, through some leaked files, XenoThreat almost entirely recruits from former military personnel, and has a very professional command structure, often compared to that of a private military corporation. So, putting these facts together, we can gather that they are well-funded, come from a professional background, and are pushing an overt political agenda. Thankfully, we know of a very similar group which matches up with XenoThreat's agenda: the Centralist political party. Made up of old, wealthy, conservative politicians, the main goal of the Centralists is giving more autonomy and authority to megacorporations, pushing all non-humans out of the UEE, and returning the power structure to one that more resembled the former Mezzer regime. Now, I'll point out that the Centralists are not themselves Mezzerites, and aren't advocating for centralized authority of a single person, but more of an oligarchy of the wealthy, similar to that which ran the late Mezzer-era UEE. With a rising number of xenophobic radicals that have popped up in the late 2940s, including a famous attempted assassination of the former Imperator for his signing of the Human-Geon Trade Agreement, it is clear that there is a growing movement of those who fear the more peaceful relationship that the new UEE has with most of its neighboring alien species. This is likely due to the economic stresses of the Geon moving into many spheres of human economy and often dominating it, likely pushing people out of their jobs, combined with the age-old xenophobia which the Mezzers took advantage of to keep the population in line, that is, driving this movement. So I don't believe that the Centralists created XenoThreat, but I do believe that some in the party are likely funding the gang, or at least ensuring they get ships and equipment, likely through a third-party group using the Militia Mobilization Initiative as cover. I firmly believe that the reason why the Centralists have targeted the Pyro system is because it is an entirely lawless system with a lot of jump points throughout the Eastern Empire, including the home base of the Centralists' main enemy, Terra. Having a base of operations with a private military whom could strike out to disrupt or disable key locations at a moment's notice would be a huge benefit for the Centralists in any conflict between their chosen capital of Earth and their rivals, the Transitionalists' chosen capital of Terra. Now, to discuss one of the more interesting factions in this whole story, the Citizens for Prosperity. Those who are observant may have noted that Dash, the founder of the CFP, has her roots in a very specific place in the Stanton system: Hurston. Not only did she work for HD, but she was an accountant, a position of some importance in the company. While this doesn't mean that she was forced into a lifetime contract like other HD employees, it is important to note that another important accountant at the company got one of the system's moons named after them. Granted, they married into the Hurston family, but it is implied that her work in the accounting department was critical and the main reason why the moon was named after her. I would be hard-pressed to believe that Hurston Dynamics would allow one of their valued accountants to just leave with this kind of personal crusade, not unless they believed they could benefit from it in some way. While I don't think HD controls the CFP like some kind of puppet organization, I don't believe that the CFP is as entirely altruistic as it claims to be. Its stated goal is to effectively colonize Pyro through making the system safe for government and corporate interests to operate inside. While I also doubt that Hurston is the only company offering to support the CFP, it is clear that there is some corporate influence in this movement. This is just a theory, but I do believe that Hurston Dynamics serves to benefit a lot from the pacification of Pyro. The company famously sees their own planet as a devaluing asset and seeks to extract as much from it as possible, hence why the entire planet is an ecological nightmare. So it isn't too far off the mark to believe that they would have an interest in pacifying the system in order to extract more resources from it, especially since advancements in shield tech may allow them to retrieve the once previously impossible to reach resources of Pyro en masse. Lastly, let's look at the most mysterious of these groups, the Frontier Fighters. The origins of this group are still a mystery, though, as I said earlier, I do believe that this group are former members of the militia that Dash formed out of her grief support group, as they are the only ones that we know narratively believed that Pyro wasn't worth saving. As to who benefits, this is harder to extract. The one thing we do know is that someone is paying significant credits to help this group mobilize, with the Frontier Fighters often paying more for their contracts than the Headhunters or Citizens for Prosperity throughout the fight for Pyro. So, even if we take the reveal that the FF are also the Slicers as some kind of misinformation, this is a group that came out of nowhere and is surprisingly well funded and supported. Then, if you take into account that they might be the Slicers as well, then it's clear that they are supported by a person or persons who are very well connected and have very little regard for human life, seeing as they had Idris frigates and extensive planning to cause maximum chaos and destruction with their attacks. If we take the CDF's claims at face value, it is clear that whoever are the ones behind the Frontier Fighters / Slicers is not connected with one of the corporations, the CDF or the Advocacy, as they've gone out of their way to antagonize and attack each of these groups. While it could be some other corporation trying to unseat those who support the CFP, like Hurston, I find this to be far too confusing and unlikely from a narrative perspective. It turns Pyro into a proxy corporate war, which doesn't seem to be what the developers want the narrative to be. So this is where I tell you about a secret group inside the UEE government who have very little regard for the consequences of their actions and report directly to the Senate, thus bypassing the UEE military and advocacy. They're simply known as the Division. The Division of Executive Services has been long hidden behind within the labyrinthine bowels of the Senate's budget. Division is responsible for the collection, analysis, or exploitation of information and intelligence in support of law enforcement, imperial security, defense, and foreign policy objectives. This can take many forms, from communication intercepts to asset gathering to counterintelligence. It utilizes operatives throughout the Empire on both domestic and foreign missions. Since it has never been officially recognized, no one really knows when Division was created. The first known mention of the Division came in the archive of the Senate subcommittee meetings in 2794, 2 years after the fall of the Mezzers. But the first potential indication of a Division action came 6 years earlier, in 2788. Nathan Warwick, an advocacy section chief, in the Terra system helped facilitate Senator Akari's meetings with the Xi'an to create the Krei-Akari Treaty that diffused tensions between the Xi'an and marked the beginning of the end of the Mezzer era. After that incident, Warwick left the advocacy and disappeared. After the fall of the Mezzers, Warwick reappeared as a quote-unquote consultant on Akari's staff before being named as the first director of the new division of executive services during that Senate subcommittee meeting in 2794. Terrified at the prospect of another despot, the Senate wanted to make sure that they were kept informed of the mood of the people, as well as the atmosphere of the other branches of the UEE. The Division of Executive Services was designed to infiltrate, keeping an eye not only on the public, but also the military and even the advocacy. The Senate Subcommittee for Internal Appraisal handles budgetary and executive oversight of Division. Again, the official incarnations of this elusive spy organization are designed to be forgettable, hence the bland names. Field agents for Division actively recruit assets within and without the UEE to keep the Senate apprised of potential crises and growing threats to Imperial security. Known within the Division as gatherers, they are charged with digging up information for Division analysts to consume. Division is even more tight-lipped than usual about its method for recruiting gatherers. Division's strength is that its agents can be anyone, so their recruitment path is personality-based more than physical. They want adaptable, intuitive, and intelligent people who are capable of being present but not being noticed, or at least forgotten soon after. The public knows nothing of the DES, not even that it exists. There have been whispers, of course, but deniability has been Division's prime directive since its inception, and thus far, they haven't been caught. This group is the only one in lore which I believe have the means, motive, and opportunity to pull off the events attributed to the Slicers/Frontier Fighters, a clandestine group who answers to the Senate, thus not having to work with local police and advocacy forces. The resources to pull off this kind of clandestine false flag operation, and a reason to do so. Remember XenoThreat? Well, given the nature of Division, it wouldn't be surprised if the Senate wanted to remove them and any other outlaw force from Pyro and install their own force to control the system that has become a nexus of jump points all over the Eastern Empire, especially after XenoThreat's brazen attack on Stanton. Why might this intelligence agency be willing to kill its own citizens and civilians, you might ask? Well, if you look to history, most secret police and intelligence organizations aren't averse to hurting or killing its own population for what they believe to be a higher purpose. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few kind of thing. Some will even go so far as to kill thousands or millions of its own people in a pursuit of retaining power. Unchecked, clandestine organizations often act above the law to achieve their goals. So why would Division be any different? What are the lives of a few hundred or thousand Stanton residents, most of whom live in a corporate state who barely values their existence, compared to the billions of lives and systems connected to Pyro? I hope I'm illustrating the cold calculus which could be applied to justify such a brutal action, especially with how skilled the Division is at covering its own tracks. I know this may sound like a long shot, but as of now, it's the only organization that I believe benefits the most from this level of wanton violence in Stanton and Pyro, keeping the various powers at play on the back foot. However, I also believe that the Frontier Fighters went rogue, targeting the CFP out of a sense of anger at their former leader betraying the cause. This mistake brought them too much scrutiny and exposed their secret before they had a chance to fully execute their plan. Thus, their current fate of being hunted down by both CFP and Headhunter forces. As for the Headhunters, there isn't really much there. Unlike the other factions with their own covert and overt patrons, the Headhunters are motivated by their own power and tradition. Pyro is their home. It has been for nearly 4 centuries, so well, let me allow them to explain their stance.
So, you're either with the Headhunters, showing these stinky that they can go for themselves and their fools, or you can right off.
So there we have it. the events and players of the First Stanton-Pyro War. I know I'm doing some theory crafting with some of this analysis, but that's because of another thing I would like to talk about now: how effective this story has been in-game thus far. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. For a dev team that has managed to craft a pretty cohesive and deep lore for the universe, this first outing is pretty bad. The overt reliance on mission text to tell the story, while trying to teach players that their actions have consequences with an entirely unearned twist, and then punishing them by tanking their rep if they chose the Frontier Fighters, is pure weapons-grade BS. I understand this is their first attempt at this kind of narrative, and I will say for their first attempt at this, considering the state of the game, it wasn't awful. However, if this is the blueprint for the rest of the year as to how they want to add content and tell stories in the game, I personally would rather they just wait until the systems can handle their ambitions. Put simply, the devs need to invest in ways to invest players in the verse beyond credits, rep, and skins. Those should be rewards or motivators to join or avoid another factions, but players will gravitate towards factions more naturally if you make it clear what those factions are about. Video games, even the best ones, are not very good storytelling mediums in the traditional sense. They have to rely on the experience of an unpredictable player to best tell stories they want. So a lot of tried and true storytelling techniques, lighting, pacing, dialogue, shot composition, just don't work well enough to elicit the same kinds of emotions. What does work is immersion and characters. Characters which can represent each faction would do wonders for players identifying the themes and purposes of each faction, giving players an idea of what these groups are about. We know this would work because the devs have already done this with the various mission givers they've added to the game in the past, only to abandon their development. I believe that if CIG picked up this technology and strategy again, applying it to the various factions vying for power in Pyro, then they would find more people passionately wanting to sign up for one or another faction. Beyond introducing these missions with the character to act as a face, some basic mission voiceover to introduce each mission would help give context on top of the mission texts and any other clues they could leave around the verse. The narrative team really needs to make sure we buy into this universe they have created. Once they do that, even mediocre missions would be more tolerable, though none of that matters if the elevators still don't work. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, think about hitting the like button, subscribing for more content, and hitting the bell icon to be notified when these release. These take a ton of time to research and edit, so dropping a like really helps tell YouTube to promote the video to other fans of lore content and Star Citizen. While I mostly focus on the universe of Star Citizen, I've also covered series like Helldivers, Starfield, Cyberpunk, and Titanfall as well. So if you like space and sci-fi, be sure to stay tuned for my own video primer on the BattleTech MechWar universe coming out soon, as well as a few other interesting videos that might be a bit out there compared to my normal ones. I'd also like to thank those on screen now for supporting the channel financially. If you want to throw in a few credits, think about becoming a member on YouTube. And if you want a bit more for your contribution, join the Ko-fi or Patreon. Patreons and Ko-fi members get early, ad-free access to all videos, including exclusive early access to my long-running Complete History of Star Citizen lore series. Check those out now in the top right if you want to know what you're getting. Now I want to hear your thoughts on this and any other lore topics in the comments below. And as always, remember, Ex Historia ad Astra.